Thank you. Thank you, everybody. A big shout out to the Center for Latino Progress, Transport Hartford Academy, and BCCO for hosting their 4th annual Multimodal and Transit Summit. It's great to be a part of this panel discussion. I'm joined today by our esteemed panelists, Dr. Mark Mitchell from George Mason University, professor at George Mason University, Commissioner Katie Dykes of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and Senator Christine Cohen, who serves as Senate Chair of the Environment Committee at the Connecticut Legislature. This is great. Welcome to Making Our Transportation Future Equitable. On that note, I'd like to open with a land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land we are on today in Connecticut is the territory of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Chattahoochee, the Golden Hill Haugasset, the Nipmuc, and the Lenape tribes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And now, now turning back to the focus of our panel discussion, making our transportation future equitable. In Connecticut, we are fighting for a clean transportation future, and we want this future to be equitable. And what we mean by equity is helping the state implement policies that prioritize climate justice, health equity, economic justice, disability justice, and a paradigm of other issues all in one. Because as many of you may be aware, transportation pollution is the leading source of pollution in Connecticut. In the past few months, we have learned that emissions from the transportation sector, according to the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's DEP, their greenhouse gas inventory report, we learned that emissions from the building and transportation sectors rose in 2018, according to the greenhouse gas inventory report. And since then, I have been grateful to work alongside Dr. Mitchell, Senator Cohen, and Commissioner Dykes in pushing for policies that could solve this problem, that can mitigate the climate crisis by mitigating carbon emissions and prioritizing the health and safety of Connecticut residents. On that note, I'd like to just give a little housekeeping rules. I would ask that everybody, aside from our panelists, remain on mute and save your questions toward the end of the discussion. I will pass the mic on to Dr. Mitchell first, followed by Commissioner Katie Dykes, followed by Senator Cohen. And each panelist will have their own take on the enormous transportation issues that we face, and will bring forth solutions for how we can tackle the climate crisis together and promote a more sustainable, more successful livelihood for all our state residents. Dr. Mitchell, I would like to pass the mic on to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thanks to Thomas and the Center for Latino Progress for sponsoring this event. I am honored to be here with Senator Cohen and Commissioner Dykes in presenting this. Thomas, if you can put up my slides, please. So I've titled this Transportation Equity, Keeping the Promise of TCI Alive. And next slide. So what I'm going to present today is I will start talking about the promise of the Transportation Climate Initiative. Then I will move into a definition of environmental justice. I'll then talk about the disparities in transportation burdens that we currently see in Connecticut. Then I will explain a little bit more what the Transportation Climate Initiative is, and then I will explain why there's been some environmental justice opposition to TCI. I will talk then about how TCI is different from past efforts at transportation, and focusing on the equity focus of transportation. And then I will end up with, if we could have equity in TCI, why can't we have equity in other transportation initiatives? Next slide, please. So what promise of TCI? From my perspective as a public health and environmental health physician that's been engaged in policy over the last 25 years, TCI was the legislation that was most likely to reduce asthma of any legislation over this time period. It was likely to reduce urban air pollution, reduce greenhouse gases, while at the same time addressing health disparities and climate. Next slide. Next slide. So why did I become interested in environmental health? Back one slide, please. As an African-American public health physician, I became concerned about health disparities. What I found was that the more I looked, that when I was the director of the Hartford Health Department, I noticed that the diseases, that although most diseases were decreasing in frequency, those that are related to the environment tended to be increasing in frequency. And not only were these diseases increasing in frequency, that these were the diseases that were accounting for most of the disparities between the life expectancy of African Americans and Latinos versus those of whites in Connecticut, as well as nationally. At that time, we first began noticing the increase in asthma. Asthma continued to increase in the 80s and 90s, and even now. New England is the part of the country where asthma has not dropped significantly over the last 10 years or so. And so I found that asthma is greatest in African Americans, but that there's only one group that has higher rates of asthma than African Americans, and that is Puerto Ricans, people of Puerto Rican descent in the US. And their asthma rates are much higher than those of any other Latino group. We did a survey in Hartford where we looked at African Americans separate from Blacks from the Caribbean, from West Indians. And then we also looked at Latinos and whites, the asthma rates in those groups. And what we found was that the asthma rates in West Indians was the lowest of any group that we looked at. Then whites were higher, then African Americans, and then Latinos. Again, we have one of the highest percentages of populations of Puerto Ricans of any city in the United States. So I also became concerned about environmental racism, where we find that that environmental hazards are disproportionately placed in communities of color. You know, when we talk about environmental racism, we're not talking about personal racism. We're not talking about people with racist thoughts and feelings and actions. We're talking about policies that have a differential effect, that affect different people of different races differently. So we find that there are many policies in Connecticut that do just that. And we find that the environmental health policy implementation process has restricted the input from people of color and those who are most impacted by environmental hazards. Next slide, please. So what is environmental justice? The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, especially those that affect those people. Next slide. So environmental justice, by fair treatment, they mean that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. Next slide. And by meaningful involvement, they mean that everyone has a chance to have input into policies that affect them, and not only have input, but to be heard and to change the outcomes of any decision-making process. But environmental justice is really all about health. Environmental hazards are disproportionately located in low-income communities and Black and Latino neighborhoods. For example, there was a study about solid waste facilities, trash incinerators, transfer stations, and again, that study, like many others, found that the greatest predictor of where hazardous waste is placed in Connecticut is the percentage of people of color in that community. And this contributes to health disparities. I have done consulting with environmental justice groups all around the country, and every place I go, I am struck with the fact that people suffer disproportionately from the diseases and die from the diseases that you would predict if you know what the toxics are in the air. You know, and so environmental racism is institutional racism, and environmental justice is about stopping the environmental injustices and changing environmental policies to reduce these health disparities. Next slide, please. Traffic, today we're going to focus on traffic-related injustices. And as you know, the major urban highways tend to intersect in the middle of urban areas. They bring an increased amount of pollution. They divide up the neighborhoods. They decrease the walkability, bikeability. How do you cross an 8-lane highway? You don't do it on foot. It's very difficult to do it on foot. You overpass, underpass, but it's much easier if you have a car. So the highways have decreased the walkability and the bikeability. Next slide, please. So in the United States, 8.7% of households have no cars. There are, in fact, more cars than there are people in the United States. Can I have the next slide, please? There are, in fact, more cars than there are people in the United States. So I see in the comment, yes, this is I-84 and I-81, and obviously Route 2 also come to Hartford, so they're major highways. Can we get the next slide, please? So Hartford ranks 8th in the United States in the percentage of households having no cars. And New Haven ranks 11th in households without cars. Waterbury and Bridgeport also have more than 20% of their households with no cars. Are we having trouble with the slides? I don't see the slides advancing. There you are. There we go. So you see on the right, the share of households without vehicles. And so this leads to transportation disparities. So there needs to be, ideally, we don't want to force households to have cars. We want to have a transportation system that is good enough that people want to leave their cars at home if they have cars, and or that they feel a need that they do not need that they do not have to have cars. That it would be better to be without cars. Next slide, please. So the air pollution in Connecticut is among the worst in the country, and transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gases, where 38% of our greenhouse gases are from the transportation sector. It's also the largest source of air pollution, with 2/3 of our air pollution coming from transportation. And that includes ozone air pollution, as well as particulate air pollution, or particularly PM 2.5 is the most toxic. That is particulates that are less than 2.5 microns in diameter. To give you some reference, the diameter of a hair is about 7 microns. I'm sorry, the diameter of a red blood cell is about 7 microns. And hair is about 30 times greater than the PM 2.5. So these are very, very small particles. They can be breathed deep into the lungs, and they carry toxics breathed deep into the lungs, along with the air pollution. So if we address transportation-related greenhouse gases, we can also address transportation-related air pollution and transportation-related health impacts. So what are these health impacts? Next slide, please. So transportation air pollution causes asthma and respiratory disease. Um, and in fact, if you look at the places around the country with the highest air pollution levels, oftentimes you'll see that they have some of the worst air uh, traffic congestion and traffic pollution. You know, much of California, um, and we receive the air pollution from New York and the tri-state area, as well as other air pollution from the Ohio Valley. In 1996, the Olympics were held in Atlanta. And during that period of time, they closed the downtown area to all automobile traffic. They only allowed public transit downtown. On the days that they closed downtown to traffic, the emergency room visit rates dropped dramatically, and in fact, the visits for asthma and other respiratory conditions declined by a third. So that shows, and as you know, last year with COVID, we also had a decline in air pollution. So that shows that if we decrease traffic, then we can expect to see increases in our health. We can expect to see immediate increases in health and reductions in asthma. Asthma and respiratory conditions aren't the only health conditions that are related to transportation. We now know that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder are associated with traffic-related air pollution. We also find that premature birth is associated with traffic, as well as sudden cardiac death. In fact, you can measure the amount of particles in the air today and predict the number of people that are going to die tomorrow, particularly among elderly people. And they die of not only respiratory conditions, but the cardiac conditions. And analysis of the Transportation Climate Initiative region-wide said that they would save 300 lives per year, according to a Harvard study. Next slide. So what exactly is or was the Transportation Climate Initiative? The Transportation Climate Initiative would place a fee on carbon in gasoline and diesel. The fee would be about 5 cents per gallon, or about $37 per year for the average Connecticut driver. And this would limit, and over the 10-year period, reduce transportation pollution by 26%. They would use this revenue to reduce pollution and improve transportation statewide, but 50% of the revenue was to be invested in overburdened and underserved communities. Next slide, please. But despite this, a number of environmental justice groups in the Northeast had some concerns about the Transportation Climate Initiative. The major concern was that that there were no community-based organizations that were involved. There were no Black-led or other people of color-led community-based organizations involved in the early planning. But that's partially because there are no people of color community-based transportation groups in Connecticut at all. And that's because of the disinvestment in environmental justice groups over the last year, over the last decades, and the because having community-based transportation groups requires funding, substantial funding, and it requires certain knowledge, skills, and of course, hard work. It requires organizing talent, legal support, as well as technical support. As you know, transportation is a very technical area. So in addition to there not being community-based BIPOC transportation groups in Connecticut, the environmental justice organizations were not invited to the table when the TCI planning, even in states with transportation groups that are led by people of color, they were not invited at the beginning. The other thing is that the experience of environmental justice groups is that cap and trade schemes have never been shown to reduce disparities. They have either not worked or have not been shown to work. And oftentimes these cap and trade schemes have exacerbated disparities. What do I mean by a cap and trade? That is where you cap the amount of pollution and that you issue credits, and then the credits are allowed to be traded so that not everybody has to reduce their pollution. And it turns out that some places that don't reduce their pollution are oftentimes environmental justice communities. So because of this long history, there has been bred a lack of trust in organizations that say that they're going to reduce pollution, but don't reduce pollution in low-income communities and communities of color. Next slide, please. So what was different about TCI? And that is that it actually had a focus on equity. TCI provided a substantial investment in underinvested communities. It proposed about $50 million per year invested in Connecticut communities that are overburdened by air pollution and or underserved by the transportation system, or both. It also allowed the flexibility in the funding to actually address the inequities in the most impacted communities. They provided for meaningful involvement of environmental justice voices. It's a real credit to Senator Cohen and to Commissioner Dykes that they actually listened and that they would embrace the suggestions on how to improve TCI to make it more equitable. And it's not just them. I think that everybody involved showed a genuine concern about addressing equity. And in fact, the investments were to be guided by an Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Board of representatives of overburdened and underserved communities. And so this Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Board was not only representative of the community, but as you know, I believe that you can find people of any demographic who will vote against the interest of that demographic. And oftentimes that happens where industry can co-opt a board, or other interest can co-opt a board, despite it requiring certain people to represent the interest of those who are most impacted. So to get around that, we recommended that there be a nominating committee of community-based organizations that would nominate the members of the Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Board, who would then be appointed by the policymakers, the elected officials, or the appointed officials, or the governor's office, whoever may be the case, but that they would select it from a list of qualified pre-screened members who will represent their given interest. And also what was different about the TCI was its focus on reducing air pollution while improving mobility in the communities most affected. I think that the Department of Transportation was a bit surprised how our focus on transportation was primarily to reduce the pollution and to make sure that there's adequate monitoring in the areas with the most pollution to assure that the pollution is reduced. Next slide, please. So what were the potential equitable transportation investments? So the potential projects to be funded included the electrification of school buses and transit buses, electrification of diesel trucks, particularly garbage trucks. The urban areas are exposed to more diesel pollution, and diesel is much more toxic, although it's not nearly as numerous as cars. There are diesel pollution contains at least 40 carcinogens, and is much more toxic than air pollution from automobiles. We also can invest in safe sidewalks and bike lanes, improving Connecticut transit service, and lowering bus fares. The study by Harvard showed that improving bus service goes a long way toward towards increasing the usage of transit and reducing the air pollution. And the study also showed that there would be a improvement in air pollution in all counties, but that there would be a reduction in the racial and ethnic air pollution disparities and health disparities. So next slide. So the question is, with transportation, with the Transportation Climate Initiative, with losing support from the governor and presumably the legislature, what can be done? Can equity apply to other Connecticut transportation projects? Can we have an equity and environmental justice advisory board for other transportation dollars? Can we have substantial set-asides to invest in transportation in the communities that are most impacted? And I believe, yes, we can. And I'd love to continue our discussion about how we can do this more equitably with all of our transportation dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you for laying out the history of environmental injustices caused by transportation, that some of which included, strong transportation pollution affecting BIPOC and low-income communities, and then explaining the mechanics of the TCI program the principles that we should continue onward with, regarding representation, regarding a seat at the table, and regarding the future being electrified, and really getting really getting decision makers to look at transportation as the collective system it really is. Um, I very much appreciate that. And now I will pass the mic on to Commissioner Dykes to give us some insight on DEEP's perspectives on equity, and how that'll play a role in their future environmental and transportation decisions. Commissioner Dykes, welcome. The mic is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. And I'm really glad to be here today to speak with everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. You can give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. I don't have any slides, but I don't need any because Mark did such a fabulous job of talking about all of the amazing work and dialogue that's been occurring over the last year and a half as we've been working together on advancing climate and clean energy and air quality programs to enhance our clean transportation system here in the state, and to ensure that we're addressing environmental justice and equity at the heart of how we're approaching clean transportation. So just to speak to the elephant in the room, obviously, you know, we are having this discussion just a few days after news has been emerging about the Governor Lamont indicating that, you know, we feel that it's been a real challenge to try to get legislative adoption of the Transportation Climate Initiative program. And I know folks have probably followed some of the news from our partners, our partner states elsewhere in New England, that there needs to be a real critical mass of states moving forward. And so the future in terms of TCI is not as optimistic for adoption as we had hoped some months ago and some weeks ago. But we're convening here today, and I think that it's especially important to have this conversation today in light of that news, because we continue to nothing has changed from the standpoint of needing solutions to help dramatically reduce emissions from the transportation sector in our state. I was with Governor Lamont several weeks ago when down in Milford at Silver Sand State Park, where we shared the news from the latest greenhouse gas inventory report. This is a report that DEEP is required to do every year to track our progress in meeting, in the state's progress in meeting the targets that were set by the legislature, which requires us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across our economy by 45% from 2001 levels by 2030. And at that event, we shared, based on the most recent, the year for most recent year for which we have data available, which is 2018. Although while we've seen significant reductions occurring in the electric power sector, because we have so many programs that we've been implementing in the power sector for many years, we continue to see emissions from the transportation sector actually increasing by a modest amount, but even a modest increase is problematic, because we know from some of the work we've done through the Governor's Council on Climate Change that we need to be on track to reduce emissions from transportation by roughly 1/3 by 2030 if we're going to meet the state's Global Warming Solutions Act targets. The transportation sector contributes the largest share of emissions of greenhouse gases in our state, and that's almost entirely from the exhaust from vehicle traffic, from cars and trucks and buses, all the vehicles that are burning gasoline and diesel to help us get around. And so clearly we have to continue to work hard towards solutions that will help us achieve that reduction on that trajectory of 30%. At the same time, we have a strong commitment to addressing air pollution from the transportation sector. Connecticut is not in attainment with federal air quality standards for ozone. Part of this is as a result of our geographic location, that the air blowing into Connecticut is already heavily laden with air pollutants from vehicle traffic and from power generation, fossil fuel combustion upwind of us. But we're also contributing significantly to air pollution here in our state as well. And that the transportation sector is responsible for 67% of those emissions. So we have implemented a whole range of different strategies to help reduce emissions from the transportation sector over the years to get back in attainment with those EPA standards. And that includes measures that we've taken with respect to power plants, fossil generation, but the transportation sector remains the largest nut to crack. And I heard from a lot of folks as we were talking about TCI that, why is it important for us to reduce air pollution here in the state of Connecticut when we need the upwind states to take action? And frankly, our experience here in Connecticut is that when we implement successful programs to reduce emissions, in many cases that will catalyze and incent other jurisdictions to adopt those programs when we prove them to be successful. That's the case with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which we implemented some years ago. And so we continue to be committed to regional solutions for that reason. But certainly air pollution, as Dr. Mitchell has pointed out, has long had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, on low-income communities in our state. We operate 14 air quality monitors around the state, and those monitors that are located in our cities, in our urban environments, adjacent to those highways and interstates that are carrying so much of that vehicle traffic, they're registering levels of air pollution that may be 20% higher than even in suburban communities in our state. And we know that Dr. Mitchell has already shared so effectively what that means in terms of the burdens that communities of color and low-income communities are carrying. So the connection between air pollution and equity and the need to advance environmental justice in our transportation sector has been clear for many years. But climate change is making that the inequitable outcomes of our transportation sector even more pronounced, even worse. And that's because as the climate warms, we know that we will experience a 5-fold increase in the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the time we hit 2050. And that's because of all the emissions that have occurred to date because of our delays and our inaction on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so for folks who have underlying respiratory illness and health issues associated with air pollution, we're going to see a 5-fold increase in the number of days when it can be challenging to breathe here in our state. So there is a direct connection between the inequities of air pollution, those impacts, climate change making those impacts worse, and that adding to the burden and multiplying, exacerbating the burdens that vulnerable populations are experiencing here in our state. So these are all reasons that we have to keep working towards solutions that we can implement to help reduce emissions as quickly as possible of both greenhouse gases and NOx emissions and other contributors to ozone and respiratory health issues. So through I share Dr. Mitchell's view that we have come a long way through our discussions and dialogue around TCI on advancing our understandings of better ways to ensure more equitable outcomes in our clean transportation investments. And I really credit Dr. Mitchell and so many folks who engaged with us and pushed us and advocated hard and helped share their experiences so that we could craft a program and a policy that would be more responsive and more effective in addressing equity and environmental justice impacts. And certainly when we started this work, I'll say that many of those aspects include commitments to transparency and ensuring community involvement in the governance ensuring that communities are adequately and community representatives are adequately supported from a resource perspective to be able to participate in the discussions that are so critical to have a more equitable outcome in how the TCI proceeds would have been spent. The good news is that we have the opportunity to take a lot of those ideas and the results of all of that dialogue and to take those models for community engagement, for more transparency and community involvement in planning and in prioritization of our clean transportation investments, and apply them to the things that we are going to be doing going forward. We have, I think folks are aware that President Biden last week, just a week ago, signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the infrastructure bill that is going to be delivering on billions of dollars of investment here in our state for clean transportation. That includes about $4.5 billion of formula funding to provide for more pedestrian and bike safety and enhancements for active transportation, helping to support our Department of Transportation to shift a lot of their transit buses to electric, helping to support the deployment of electric vehicle charging in federally designated alternative fuel corridors, helping to support DEEP. We're going to be really eager to engage with EPA and work with a lot of our municipalities to compete for grants that EPA will be distributing for electric school buses, for clean school buses here in our state. So there is an enormous amount of funding that's going to be coming our way, either through formula funds where it's prescribed that we get a certain percentage of the funding, or through competitive grant programs where we're going to be competing with other states and jurisdictions to get as much of this funding as possible. But either way, we're going to have an opportunity that we couldn't have counted on months ago to see a significant federal investment in clean transportation here in our state. And I know that the Biden administration has made it a very high priority addressing equity and ensuring equity and environmental justice are at the forefront of how these dollars are spent. And that includes the Justice 40 approach that the Biden administration has been pushing forward. And so all of the work that we've been doing here at the state level in Connecticut and all of the dialogue around TCI, I think sets us up really well to ensure that how we're implementing and pursuing this federal investment opportunity through the infrastructure bill will have the opportunity to bring some of those transparent and governance commitments that we talked about in TCI into the day-to-day implementation of how we're approaching this new federal opportunity. I think that we also, that will be really important because one of the things that I've realized through this process is that there are a lot of different ways you can invest to help reduce air pollution and tackle climate change. And so that's why it's even more critical to ensure we have community input into how we select those investments and what types of programs we're advancing. So for example, something that I hadn't anticipated when we started talking about TCI is how much we would hear from folks about the importance of transportation for workforce mobility, to ensure that people could get to the jobs that they're seeking, which may not be directly in their community, and have frequent and reliable and predictable transit and other options to connect them to employment opportunities. This is something that I think we can be really thoughtful about in terms of how we're implementing the federal infrastructure bill to make sure that we're investing in things like workforce mobility programs that at least that I just offer that as one little example of something that we heard about that was new to me when we started the TCI discussions. Another example that I'd highlight is traffic signal modernization. I was really surprised to learn just how impactful traffic signal modernization is in terms of reducing air quality, air emissions in our state. Traffic signal modernization for folks who may not be familiar, although I know this is a very knowledgeable crowd. They include smart switches and signals that can help to optimize for traffic flows and reduce idling. It can also include investments in roundabouts. But these are, when you look at the numbers, they're incredibly impactful in terms of reducing air emissions. So we can prioritize investments in these kinds of projects in communities that are especially overburdened with air pollution. We can just make that much more impact. So I think that it's really what I just highlight these two examples to share how important it is for us to ensure we have a governance process where we can engage from and hear directly from communities about what solutions they need and want, and also to bring analysis and information to communities about the relative benefits and effectiveness of different strategies to help inform selection of the best, most impactful investments. So I'm really eager to get to work, building on a lot of the engagement that we did through TCI to share with folks what we're going to be working on, our plans and priorities for implementing the infrastructure bill. I know that there's some areas where we'll need matching funds, where we see opportunities to reduce barriers to engagement and participation in some of these programs. We'll need to engage with our legislative champions on those opportunities. But we're, moving forward and looking ahead at every opportunity we have. And right now we have a pretty significant one coming from the federal government. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Commissioner Dykes, for that heartfelt and genuine response. It is good to know that the DEEP will still keep equity at the forefront of their administration's policies moving forward, and we're glad to know that advocates can definitely work with you and your team on a more sustainable future. And to your point, Commissioner Dykes, on paving the way for a clean transportation future through legislation, we have Senator Christine Cohen here, who has been astounding in the Environment Committee, and we should definitely poke into what Senator Cohen may have in mind for the Environment Committee this coming legislative session. There were, in addition to TCI, there were bills concerning medium and heavy duty vehicle standards, as well as a bill concerning the direct sale of electric vehicles. I know that wasn't an Environment Committee bill, but I think folks would like to know, where those initiatives may stand as well moving forward. Senator Cohen, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Alex, and so glad to be here. I'm glad you're able to host this Northeast Multimodal Transit Summit once again, and hopefully one of these days will be in person once again. But it was so great to hear from Dr. Mitchell and Commissioner Dykes, agree with everything that they're saying, and so grateful for all of their hard work, as well as so many of you on this call in progressing really important legislation pertaining to climate and clean air. While the Environment Committee has been focused on climate, pollution, environmental justice, waste reduction, waterway health, resiliency, and I could really go on and on and on. In light of the recent news on TCI, I think it's more important than ever that we prioritize our proposals towards real and meaningful climate action. Obviously, what we were hearing about in terms of the infrastructure bill and its passage it's a fantastic win for the environment and certainly our state. However, as Commissioner Dykes said, many of the programs require matching dollars for which we don't necessarily have a revenue source. There is a lot in there that doesn't require a matching dollar source, and all of it is really great news for the state, dealing, with everything from, pollution, resiliency, clean drinking water, and certainly as it pertains to our conversation today, ensuring that we have sustainable transportation, creating more electric vehicle infrastructure, and clean school buses, which is something of particular importance to me. And I know so many of you, as we look forward, some of the work that we were really making good progress on, I think you'll see a resurgence of some of the bill proposals, pertaining to environmental justice in particular. I know the DEEP, under the direction of Commissioner Dykes, has been hard at work on our environmental justice laws right now. We did do some updating in 2019 and made some progress there, and intend on making further progress, looking to the New Jersey model and what can we do to impact our statutes here in Connecticut and for the better impact our environmental justice communities. Certainly transportation is the focus. We know that our largest source of pollution is coming from the transportation sector in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And so, we're largely focused on what we can do, what's a meaningful solution resulting in better air quality and health outcomes, especially in our environmental communities. So I intend to, see to it that we get that medium heavy duty emissions bill, as you mentioned, Alex, over the proverbial finish line. We came really close in the last session. Unfortunately, couldn't get it out of the House, but I think you'll certainly see some tighter language around that and adopting California's emission standards, and hopefully making progress in the medium and heavy duty arena. I also love to see us talk about, what sorts of things we're looking at when we welcome new business into the state. We had a bill passed pertaining to data centers and the amount of pollution that they create as a result of their electricity use and their backup generation. And so I think we need to take be really mindful about the types of businesses we're welcoming into the state, and if we are going to welcome those businesses in, how are we going to be responsible about doing so in partnership with those companies. And so we had language around data centers that we worked on closely with the executive branch, Commissioner Dykes, as well as Commissioner Lehman of DECD. And we had some agreed upon language, and unfortunately in the 11th hour, it just didn't make it over the finish line. And so I think we really need to revisit that, put our heads together and talk about what we really want for the state of Connecticut when it comes to new business and how that interacts with environmental considerations and goals. And so I'll be looking to restart the conversation around that. I really intend to work very closely with my colleagues on the Environment Committee, of course, as the Senate chair, but I've been working really closely with Senator Will Haskell, who's the Senate chair of the Transportation Committee, as well as my colleagues in the House, to come up with some proposals now that, TCI has really had to take a back burner given recent news. As Dr. Mitchell said, what sort of pieces of the proposal can we put in place to drive Connecticut forward towards cleaner air and climate change mitigation strategies? And so, Senator Haskell and I, certainly from the Senate side, we're really championing the TCI bill, and we want to see real meaningful progress being made. And so the two of us will continue to put our heads together, together with Commissioner Dykes to see what we can come up with. I certainly, as I mentioned, would like to see more by the way of electrification of school buses. How can we make that happen? Certainly a win for the state's children who, are developing particularly high rates of asthma. And certainly we know, as we've heard, not only today, but time and time again, that communities of color and urban centers and communities comprised of low-income individuals have been disproportionately impacted by emissions. And how do we focus our energy on those communities for sustainable pollution reduction? And so that's really what I'd like to see us talking about. We also have a long way to go on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. You mentioned, Alex, the bill that was before transportation. There's also been a couple of bills before energy and technology. We do have a long way to go. I think we're making some good progress. I know that there was just another bank of chargers put in, I believe it was in Berlin this past week. But we have to also make additional progress by way of our cheaper program, and what can we do to make electric vehicles themselves more affordable, developing a used car program as well, and making sure that we're getting electric cars into the hands of everyone, not the ultra wealthy folks, because we know that we really want to have an impact in communities that are being disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And some of that is, as it pertains to vehicles and vehicle emissions. So that's what I would say will be our focus. I'm happy to take any questions if that's sort of the format that you had in mind for the program. But that's what I think the Environment Committee will be really focused on as we move into this short session coming up next year.
Thank you, Senator Cohen, and you can be assured that you will definitely have a lot of partners here that will stick by you in pushing for these clean transportation alternatives. And to your point, we are now in the Q&A portion of our agenda. This panel, this portion of the panel will close at 4:30, and I'll take any questions, and I see one that was just popped in the chat, the question is, how are Connecticut's urban buses? Do you have EV sharing programs? This sounds like a cheaper related question. Senator Cohen, would you like to take the first stab at this?
I think it's probably, Commissioner, do you have an answer for that? I think it's probably best suited for the commissioner.
Yeah, I didn't get the first part of the question but I can say that, we've been looking at the cheaper program. For folks who aren't familiar, the cheaper program is something we started several years ago, at the time with like kind of one-time money that we got from settlements and different things. And now we're really proud to have permanent funding at the level of $3 million a year. It enables us to provide about $2,000 on average in rebates for EV purchasing electric passenger vehicles. It's primarily targeted at residential consumers as opposed to businesses. But I think that this is an example of something that we should really be looking hard at. Could we expand the cheaper program, provide more funding to it, and through that be able to support conversion of fleets to electric? Because I hear from a lot of businesses that they're really interested in getting some of the benefits of lowering their operating and maintenance costs by switching over to EVs. This is great for fleets that where you have the vehicles driving lots of miles. You think about livery or Uber or Lyft vehicles, for example, but the cheaper program isn't really set up to do that necessarily, because it's more focused on, I think there's a limitation on the number of rebates you can get per vehicle registrant. But I think back to the ultimate question here, to the extent that we're able to get more, have more funding for cheaper and be able to expand it for fleets, we could work to provide incentives for municipalities, for example, or others who want to work with ride sharing companies and others that are providing these new kind of mobility or not even that new mobility solutions for shared vehicles, and to ensure that that's prioritizing, electric vehicles for those shared vehicle options. We certainly know how important this is from when you think about, looking at some of our urban communities that are overburdened by air pollution, where vehicle ownership, is much lower than in other parts of our state. So to the extent that we can eliminate some of those barriers of vehicle ownership, and provide for access for clean electric vehicle use through these types of sharing programs, that's a huge win. We're just not positioned with our current program to do it, but we really want to get into that space and incent that. So hopefully that answers the question.
That was a sound answer. And follow-up question for you, Commissioner Dykes. With the state's goal being emission reduction, in order to get us back on track with the Global Warming Solutions Act, how can we ensure that state agencies are all aligned in that goal and not working against one another?
Yeah, I think this is something that we're, really thinking carefully about. I saw some analysis last week that, was suggesting that the infrastructure bill, the transportation funding, the electric and the infrastructure bill, if it's not carefully managed or directed to the right things, could even, could support investments that might actually increase emissions. So I think this goes back to, what Dr. Mitchell was saying in terms of ensuring that we're bringing all the best practices from TCI around transparency and governance to how we're investing the federal dollars that are going to be coming forward, so that we can ensure that that we continue to have alignment across agencies in directing these investments in ways that will benefit communities that are overburdened by air pollution. The TCI program had a clear benchmark of a minimum of 50% of proceeds to be spent on, in communities that are overburdened or underserved, and that we're prioritizing those measures for investment that are going to have a really significant impact in terms of reducing emissions. I think that, I'll just say there is some unfinished business here. We didn't have a definition in the TCI language of overburdened or underserved. And so that's something that is really important and timely for us to think through what those definitions look like, to the extent that we want to measure and track the investments that are coming, that are going to occur as a result of the federal funding. We need to have some way to better define what overburdened and underserved means. At the same time, we have, I know there's a lot of work happening right now with different experts who want to provide support for states and state agencies and municipalities to have tools for to even just analyze what the greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution emission impacts of different investments will be. So having those kinds of calculators and tools is also really urgent, so that we can score projects and score investments and make sure that decision makers have the right information to know as they're what the impacts will be as they're choosing between different projects.
Thank you. And now this one is for Commissioner Dykes and Senator Cohen. Dr. Mitchell, I'll also allow you to respond to this as well, in case you have any insight. This is regarding land use policy and the interconnection of land use policy and transportation choices. Given this person says changing our current travel patterns to electric will not do much to change the health and equity disparities of our current system of transportation, including little transit use. Commissioner Dykes, would you like the first stab at this?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that this is a really important aspect. Like, I would point to this as one of those important choices that we need to be looking at in terms of the infrastructure bill funding. How are we know that the DOT programs for bike and pedestrian improvements are often oversubscribed by municipalities. But so there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of projects there. But we need to be able to provide support to municipalities to help those projects move faster so that we can do more of them. I think there's a lot of funding in the federal bill that's going to be coming forward to support those types of investments. Certainly finding the matching funds is always, can always be challenging. Some of those programs at the state level are supported with bond authorizations. And so there's a lot of different competing demands for those sorts of things. But certainly this is something we talked about a lot in the TCI context, and I think that applies here too. Our focus in terms of achieving our carbon goals is not just on electrifying our current system of passenger vehicles, but providing for investments in active transportation here in the state that will help reduce the amount of driving that's happening overall. Really interesting, one of the reasons that we've actually seen emissions in the transportation sector increase, it's not necessarily because, it's kind of curious that we would see emissions increase because of vehicle efficiency, right? The efficiency of our vehicles in terms of the miles you get per gallon has actually improved, but people are driving more. And even with the pandemic, we had a slight lull, but we saw vehicle miles traveled pick up. People were driving more, and that's really, kept pace this year, which is kind of surprising, even given the pandemic. But the other really amazing thing that happened during the pandemic is during that period, very early on, when people were staying home and when driving reduced, a lot of folks were getting out on their bikes and getting out and commuting in these different ways, which really speaks to the need to build infrastructure that's safe and convenient for active transportation. It's not really a question, I think, of whether people want, or there's behavioral kind of barrier to people wanting to bike commute, for example, but whether people feel safe doing it. I think that experience during the pandemic highlighted that, less cars on the road meant people felt more comfortable pursuing active transportation. So it's going to require a lot of investment. I think the federal infrastructure bill will help with that, but it's going to, a lot of these demands are going to come on state agencies to help move projects forward, but also on municipalities who are in the lead a lot of times in terms of moving projects forward and getting them to construction and that sort of thing. And so that's a place where, for folks getting involved at the local level in those planning processes, you can have a huge impact, because all of a sudden there's going to be money. It's not just going to be a question of having money available. It's going to be, we'll have the money, but it's going to be a question of having the motivation and the prioritization happening at the local level to help get those projects deployed. So I'm really excited, about what we can do there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, right? The commissioner did such a great job with that question, but I'll just add to that. The infrastructure bill, though we do require matching funds for a lot of these programs, and those can be hard to come by and very competitive grant programs that we'll have to apply for. We haven't seen an infusion of dollars like this into Connecticut in a very, very long time, if ever. Certainly, if you add up all the transportation dollars in this infrastructure package, we're talking about billions of dollars. And while this might just scratch the surface on what we need, it is huge for the state of Connecticut. And so when we're talking about connectivity and making sure that folks who can't take advantage of public transportation will finally be able to do so, that will have a tremendous impact down the road on our emissions. Additionally, making sure, as we already talked about, making sure that folks in lower income communities, but perhaps in more rural communities where there won't be necessarily that connectivity, how do we get electric vehicles in the hands of those folks? And how do we create the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure along the way to make sure that they don't have the range anxiety or the reasons for passing up electric vehicles as they do now. And all of those things together can have a real tremendous impact.
Dr. Mitchell, any add-on?
Yes, I mean, obviously there's the, land use does matter, and zoning matters, and, how you do that. Obviously there's the zoning for transit-oriented development. We want to, and zoning to, require sidewalks in places that don't have sidewalks, repairing the sidewalks. There's a lot that can be done, and it all matters. It all makes a difference. I'll stop there.
And to that point, I will also add that in tandem with advocating for reduction of emissions from the transportation sector, it's also crucial that everyone here participate in energy efficiency board proceedings. They're held, the Energy Efficiency Board meets at least once a month, as well as participating in Public Utilities Regulatory Authority dockets, really making sure that Connecticut expand its clean energy portfolio so that demand reduction is prioritized. Reducing the amount of fossil fuels we use and increasing the amount of clean energy options in the state is very important. I'm going to direct this next question to Dr. Mitchell first, and this question is, I'm going to fuse these together. Given that transportation emissions are rising, is it remotely possible for Connecticut to meet its 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals without TCI? And also, what role can the private sector or big corporations play in advancing racial equity within transportation?
So those are great questions. So we obviously do have to address the transportation sector, but as I said before, TCI, what we've learned from TCI can probably be applied to other transportation programs. And we need to figure out how to do that, how to make them more equitable, how to focus. When I was involved with transportation, I was quite surprised at how little they really took into account pollution and meeting our state standards, our state air pollution standards. That needs to be taken much more seriously. And like I said, we can address climate and health and air pollution and equity all at the same time, and we should. With regard to what private groups can do and industry can do, in my neighborhood, almost 50% of the households don't have automobiles, but we have some of the highest transportation-related pollution. We need to have charging stations in the cities. Every garage should be required to have a certain number of electric charging stations, and we should have the fleets should be electrified. A lot of the businesses have fleets of automobiles, and they need to be electrified. I was so glad that the post office is moving forward with electrification. But that's what private companies can do to improve the air pollution in urban areas.
Yeah, I would say too, just to add on to that, Alex, is that I think that's a great point, and we're starting to see, as the commissioner said as well, more and more companies really wanting to convert their fleets over and electrify. So that's the good news. Figuring out how companies are going to move that way and the investment dollars that they're going to need to put in to do that is another question. But also we're seeing really promising things like e-scooters popping up and electric bikes in the cities. And that's all private sector, which I think is fantastic, fantastic partnerships with our urban centers. And we're really seeing it take off. Not as much in Connecticut, though I hope it will. But when when you're traveling down in DC, for example, they're everywhere. And I know that that's coming into Connecticut. It's, slowly taking off. But as we talk about multimodal means of transportation and private sector, I think that's something important that we shouldn't discount.
Thank you, Senator Cohen. We're at the last minute now. I'll ask all panelists if you all have any last comments for the moment. Commissioner Dykes, any last comments on your end?
No, I just want to say I really appreciate all of the work that the Center for Latino Progress and Dr. Mitchell and Senator Cohen, I mean, everyone who's on this panel today has been investing an enormous amount of time in our discussions around the Transportation Climate Initiative and how to make that initiative work for Connecticut, because you saw the promise and the necessity of having significant investments in addressing equity and environmental justice and reducing emissions from transportation. So in many cases, I guess it makes me very optimistic for what we can do going forward at this moment that we have all of this federal funding coming. I think it interestingly means that all that investment of time and work is positioned us to be ready in an unexpected way for ensuring that equity and environmental justice are at the center of how we approach this new investment opportunity. You certainly set that expectation. I think that's it's been clear for everyone on the administration side that's been working on TCI, and I think that will carry forward in what we do going ahead.
Yes. Yeah, and I would also like to, again, thank those who sponsored this. I know it takes a lot of work from a lot of people. And I want to remind people how important it is to have those at the table who are most impacted by not only the pollution, but who do not get the benefits of transportation. And as we move forward with electrification, don't forget making sure that there are electrification for apartment buildings and for other and for urban areas. I'm afraid that urban areas are going to get left out, and then 30 years down the road there won't be charging stations in urban areas that are available to the residents. So again, I think that by having those who are most impacted and in the communities that have been disinvested at the table, that we'll have much better solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly, I know we're running over now, but I just wanted to echo those comments and thank everybody today for their attendance and for their questions, and certainly the Center for Latino Progress and all the folks on this call for pulling this together and being present and being such advocates in ensuring that we have a cleaner place to live and cleaner air to breathe.
Thank you
so much, everybody. It was a big pleasure to have you. And Alex, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just about to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a transport rifle ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University, studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work with us if interested. We hope to see you around.